All right, rational people think at the margin. What the hell does that mean? All right. As we'll see in all of the economic frameworks that we look at, or all the economic models, inherently, all of the actors or agents are doing the best they possibly can. If they've got an objective, if they want to maximize profits, for example, they're going to do their very best to maximize profits. They're rational. And in doing so, rational people do the best they possibly can to achieve whatever objectives serves their interest. Okay? And in making those choices, they do so by evaluating the cost and benefits of marginal changes, incremental changes, from whatever their current position is or their current plan is. We'll look at a few concrete examples. Once again, bringing it back to your choices, the kind of choices you make. When you consider whether to go to college for an additional year, suppose you finish your freshman year, now the question is it rational for me to go to my sophomore year? Everybody says, well, gee, we just expect to go right through until you get your bachelor's degree. But a number of people decide to terminate well before that. Now, some people do so because the opportunity cost of their time is outrageous, right? A freshman basketball player at University of Kentucky, is the probability of that person coming back if they're really a superstar for their sophomore year is near zero. Why? Because their opportunity cost of staying in college is astronomical. And if they're driven largely by short-run economics, they clearly are going to find it in their self-interest to terminate. But in any event, you have to compare the fees and wages foregone, and now you have to compare that to the extra income that you as a student would earn with an extra year of education. And that means you've got to take the present value of the future stream of your earnings versus what you would gain by terminating and capturing short-run wages for a year instead of attending college. When a manager of a company decides whether to increase output, this person must compare the cost, the incremental cost of whatever labor or materials they need, and what are the incremental revenues from the additional output that they would generate. Okay? Because when we say from existing plants, if I've got an ongoing company and it's producing a certain level of products, take an ice cream parlor, it's producing so much ice cream, and now it's deciding to produce even more. Now it's going to produce more. What is the incremental value of the additional ice cream it's going to produce, and how much more in the way of labor or materials does it need to achieve that incremental revenue? And the choice should be made by comparing that incremental revenue to the incremental cost. That's what principle 3 says. Okay, principle 4, people respond to incentives. In fact, as your textbook suggests, there's an economist who says this is all that matters in economics. Everything else is commentary. Well, it's not true. If that were true, I shouldn't spend any time on the first few principles. But the argument is that you could count on people to respond to their self-interest. And something that induces a person to act or change what decisions they would otherwise make is driven by the prospect of reward or punishment. Rational people respond to incentives. Simple examples. When gas prices rise, there's incentives for consumers to buy more hybrid cars and fewer gas-guzzling SUVs. What was the General Motors product that was out there about a decade ago, the Hummer? Do you see that anymore? A couple weeks ago, I was looking for it. They don't exist. Why don't they exist? One of the reasons they don't exist today is gasoline prices are ranging from $3 to $4.50 per gallon, depending on the time or season of the year, where when those Hummers came out, gasoline prices were running $1.75 to $2.50 per gallon. So that's a clear indication that people do respond to economic incentives. Cigarette taxes, when they increase dramatically, there's been all sorts of studies indicating that teen smoking falls. Let's take a concrete example. I'm going to specify the example. Let me back up. Go through this too fast. Let's suppose, hypothetically, that you have a 1996 Mustang, and you've already spent $1,000 on repairs of this Mustang, all right? And at the last minute, before you've sold the Mustang, the transmission becomes dysfunctional. It dies. Now, you find out that it would cost you $600 to have that car repaired, or you can sell the car as is. In other words, you want to disclose it to potential buyers that the transmission doesn't work, right? But as a result, you're faced with two choices. And let me give you a few more facts. The book value, let's suppose the book value is $6,500 if the transmission works, right? And it's $5,700 if the transmission doesn't work. Right? Alternatively, let's suppose the book value is $6,000 if the transmission works and $5,500 if it doesn't. Okay? So my question to you, given those facts and given your rational choice, which would you end up doing? Under A, would you invest in the repairs? Remember, you've already spent $1,000, right? Okay? And there, under the facts that I've given you, you have to spend another $600. Would you do it? And tell me why. Go ahead, tell me why. Right, and specifically, I'm only going to invest $600. That means I'll have, pardon? Go ahead, you tell me. Right, so it makes good sense. What about the 1,000? Yes? Precisely. It doesn't matter. In fact, it's referred to formally as sunk cost. Something that's already happened that's sunk isn't part of the marginal decision that's going to maximize your economic welfare or your economic interest. Sunk cost is an important concept, and it confuses people again and again because they keep thinking, well, gee whiz, I want to get that 1,000 back too. Right? I spent the 1,000, I want it back. But that's bad decision making. And by the way, I don't want to represent that in terms of common sense and everyday decision making that this is an easy concept. At Harvard, teaching graduate students, MBA students, there were 75 students in my class, and only 2 of them fundamentally understood that concept. And these are people going for their master's degree, already having a bachelor's degree, and some of them were 35 and 40 coming back for their MBA. They still didn't understand the concept of sunk cost. But this simple example illustrates quite clearly that you shouldn't pay any attention, as you noted, to a cost that you've already incurred that has nothing to do with the choice that you currently face. What about the second example? What about B? What happens there? Yes? Say what? Speak up. Right. Perfect. This is a good beginning to this class. The right answer is both. The right answer straight away. So in the first instance, yes, indeed, you do it. In the second instance, you would be a fool to do so, right? All right. So that is an illustration of the basic concepts with regard to marginal decision making. And here is just an emphasis on your point that the $1,000 doesn't matter, right, in this decision. And that is, as I indicated, a sunk cost. And note that the incentives changed as you move from A to B. That's why the choice is different in the two, because the incentives aren't the same. All right. Okay, now how do people interact economically? I'm talking economics. I'm not talking generally. I'm talking how people interact economically. All right. The first fundamental principle here is trade can make everybody better off. What do we mean by this? None of us can be totally self-sufficient. We're not going to be in the business of making our own food, farming, producing our own products that we need every day, going out and purchasing cotton and transforming it into clothes that we're going to wear. There's specialization. Some people are much more efficient at producing those goods than we are. We should focus, each of us as an individual, doing what we do best. And moreover, competition among various people is a good thing, not a bad thing. And moreover, specialization leads to lower cost of producing various goods and transferring them. Take the illustration at a much broader level. Look at China versus the United States. If you listen to the public discourse, there are a number of politicians that are very concerned about China growing year in and year out from 8 to 9.5% per year, where we're growing 1 to 2% per year. If you get out to 2035, 2040, the Chinese economy will be larger than the US economy. And a number of politicians said, oh, that's terrible, that's terrible. You know, they're going to end up being larger than us. It's not terrible, it's great. Why is it great? Because they become more efficient, they have certain specializations, they can buy our goods where we have specializations, and vice versa. We'll benefit from the trade and all of us will be better off. In any event, those particular politicians, even I'm sure a number of them had some basic economics, but it didn't stick. All right, we get better prices for whatever goods we're more efficient producing. And mutual trade is a positive, and it results in a larger size of the economic pie. Okay, next. Markets are usually a good way of organizing economic activity. What do we mean by organizing economic activity? It means determining what goods are going to be produced, how are they going to be produced, how much of each of those goods will be produced, and who ends up getting those goods. Markets generally, not in all instances, but they're generally an efficient mechanism for allocating scarce resources through the decentralized decisions that all households and firms make as they interact in the market. Okay? Now, there is a very famous book by Adam Smith called The Wealth of Nations that was actually published in the same year that the Declaration of Independence was published here in the United States. And in that book, he specifies what's referred to as the invisible hand. And the concept of the invisible hand is that in the choices and decisions that various households make and firms make can promote the public interest or can promote economic well-being. In other words, it almost sounds contradictory, but if each and every member of society pursues their own self-interest, and markets, and this is a key assumption, and markets are functioning well, then in their pursuit of their own economic self-interest, they will maximize efficiency. They will maximize the public interest, or they will maximize the size of the economic pie. Right? Now, the invisible hand itself works through the price system. Take a simple example. Suppose the price of apple spikes. When that spikes, what happens as we walk into a grocery store and suddenly purchasing an apple costs twice as much for us as consumers as it did the prior week? Well, many of us are going to decide to substitute that apple for some other product, perhaps an orange, perhaps a pear, whatever. But that means there's going to be less demand at those high prices. But what happens to the apple producer when those high prices take place? That apple producer, she sees those very high prices and says, gee whiz, I can make more profits by expanding my output of apples. So she ends up expanding the amount of apples that she's producing. And suddenly the market then adjusts because now there's less demand, there's more supply, and that spike in apple prices begins to adjust downward. And that's what Adam Smith had in mind when he speaks about the invisible hand and the instrument by which that invisible hand takes the economic self-interest of each and every member of society to satisfying the aggregate welfare interest of all of society is through prices. It's the interaction of buyers and sellers that determine those prices. Each price ends up reflecting whatever value that good has to the buyers and also the cost of producing that good. So the prices end up guiding self-interested households and firms that make decisions, result in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, maximizing society's well-being. Right? Now, if you come circling back to a current event, if you look at the Occupy movement, they certainly wouldn't accept this proposition, right? If you spent 20 minutes or half an hour talking to any one of those people and said, gee whiz, Adam Smith, come on, he had the right answer. Let everybody pursue their own self-interest, and we'll end up collectively as a society be better off than if we limited their self-interest. They wouldn't accept that, would they? Why wouldn't they? That's certainly one argument, but I'm thinking about something much simpler. The invisible hand works if and only if the markets are well functioning and they're efficient, and the prices, that instrument, those prices are reflecting how people value the good and what is the cost of producing that good. There are two instances where that is certainly not true, and I'll illustrate those in terms of the incentives for governments to supplement what markets otherwise would determine in terms of the allocation of scarce resources. Okay? What do governments end up doing? What's the public sector all about? What's its role? For example, the Occupy movement, it's not just the tragedy of commons, but in addition, I don't believe as yet they put a concrete proposal on the table. If they have, I've missed it. Right? The one proposal is what the 1% receives in the way of income and wealth in the United States versus what the 99% has achieved, and the fact that economic well-being for many people within the United States has been flat for a decade. And the great fear is that the next generation, for the first time in the U.S. history, is not going to do as well economically as their mother and father have done. Right? It's a frightening thought, right? Because you're not going to continue to grow if in fact that turns out to be true. But if I come back to the prescription that they're concerned about, they want, by the way, I'm speculating now because I haven't sat down to talk to all of them, but the natural conclusion of their actions and the public discourse that's taken place, they want government to do more with regard to equality or equity, more redistribution, right? Higher taxes on, quote, the rich, and then use those higher taxes to redistribute income and wealth. And maybe you do that through education, which has a long-term effect, not a short-term effect, or maybe you do it through negative income taxes. There are lots of different vehicles for doing so from a public policy standpoint, but they're really looking to the public sector to change the outcomes that currently exist. In any event, what do governments do, and what do they do well? One thing that governments of the public sector is engaged in is enforcing property rights, and they do that through the rule of law, through the court system, through enforcement, police actions. You know, stop and ask yourself the following question. Suppose there were no property rights at all. Would you accumulate anything? That's a thought experiment. Ask yourself the question. If it turns out that, let's make it simpler. Let's suppose for automobiles there's no property rights. You know, somebody can walk down the street and see your automobile and there's a common key for all automobiles. And you get in that automobile, somebody comes along and says they want your automobile, and they drive away, and no one's enforcing the property right. Under those circumstances, would anybody own automobiles? No. So enforcing property rights is critical from the standpoint of at least the first condition for a well-functioning market economy. So clearly there would be no incentive for generating income. Certainly you wouldn't save anything, right? Because if you saved anything and invested, however you happen to invest, if somebody can take it away from you without any consequences, it would have a chilling effect on your incentives to make that investment. Right? Okay. Now, coming back to Adam Smith and why why won't markets in all seasons and under all circumstances actually have people pursuing their self-interest also maximizing efficiency or maximizing the economic size of the pie. And that does not always happen because there are market failures. And those market failures include all types. The principal types are externalities, which we'll see again and again in the second part of the course, namely when the production or consumption of some good affects bystanders. That bystanders are people that aren't engaged in the production and distribution of that product. The use of a lake by fishermen or recreational activities. They would be a bystander for a plant, say, that's producing some chemical and discharging waste into that lake. Okay? The discharging of waste into that lake is an externality. It has an adverse effect on fishermen or recreational users, and the plant that is producing that chemical doesn't have or doesn't incur the cost that they impose upon the environment and the diminution of value that would otherwise accrue to the fishermen and recreational people. Right? So that is a market failure. Secondly, market power. A single buyer or seller has substantial influence over the market price. Now, that well-functioning price instrument in the lens that's provided by Adam Smith doesn't exist, right? Because that price is no longer an efficient mechanism for mapping economic self-interest into maximizing efficiency or the size of the pie, right? And as a result, government can come along and try to correct those two situations. Here in this country, up until the early 1970s, there was no agency of the public sector that was actively engaged in trying to manage the adverse consequences of market activities, namely the externalities that are mentioned here. It wasn't until the early 1970s that the Environmental Protection Agency was established. And its first major legislation